Hello, everybody. My name is Paul Salem. I'm the president of the Middle East Institute here in Washington, D.C. I'm thrilled to welcome you all to today's webinar on a new report that came out of CAP, the Center for American Progress, called Strategic Reengagement in the Middle East Towards a More Balanced and Long-Term Approach to U.S. Policy. This is a very timely report in the midst of debates that started during this administration and before on the level of engagement that the U.S. should or shouldn't have in the Middle East, whether it should disengage more, what should the strategies be. And I think this report really presents a balanced view and then a view that talks for or argues for a sustained, balanced, long-term engagement in the Middle East. And I'm eager to get this session started, to hear partly from the author, one of the authors of this report, and to hear from our great panel that is here to comment and debate on this report. Brian Katulis is one of the authors. Peter Jewell is the other author. Both Brian and Peter Jewell are or were at CAP. Brian still has a relationship with CAP as a non-resident senior fellow, but we're very thrilled that he recently joined the Middle East Institute as a senior fellow and vice president for policy. We're also very happy that this is a joint event being organized by the Middle East Institute and the Center for American Progress. And I'm very happy to have with us Mara Rudman, both representing CAP and as a panelist in this session, and I'll introduce her in a moment as well. Let me say a few words about Brian. Brian, as I mentioned, is now with MEI. He's one of the co-authors. He's had experience working at the National Security Council and the U.S. Departments of State and Defense. He's authored a number of studies and reports, co-authored a number of books on U.S. policy generally, on the Middle East and Middle East policy, as well as on American affairs. He writes regularly about American affairs as well. He's going to be starting us off in this session talking about the main findings of this report. And after he does that, I will introduce the other members of the panel and we'll get started in a discussion. So Brian, let me turn it over to you to lay out some of the main thoughts and main findings.
Great. Thank you, Paul, and thank you to the Center for American Progress and the Middle East Institute for co-hosting this. As I think about the holiday season almost upon us and the idea of spending some time with extended family, with all the joys and challenges that sometimes come with that. And in many ways, this event is my extended work family. And I have deep connections, not new with the Middle East Institute in terms of working with, but certainly new working for and staying connected with our friends at CAP. And I'm honored that we have such a distinguished panel that I've learned from their career to talk about these ideas. This report we're talking about is a thought experiment. It's a thought experiment. It's the thing that think tanks should do, which is offer ideas. I stress that basic point because sometimes I think in Washington, D.C. these days, where there's so many heated debates and advocacy-driven debates, we often forget that discourse and dialectic and an exchange of ideas is important. And if there's a core message in this report, it's America should double down rather than disengage in the Middle East. Again, double down rather than disengage, but double down through diplomacy and through other tools that are often talked about, but often not used or budgeted, as we saw in the recent vote on the Hill just yesterday on the Pentagon budget plus up. I offer this argument for doubling down, understanding that when I read the room here in Washington, it's not a popular argument. You look at the things that were in common and may have been in common for both Presidents Obama, Trump, and in the first year of Biden. One common feature is that they wanted to, in a sense, pull back or stay above the fray because of all of the challenges that the Middle East has presented. And in my view, if you look at almost the first year of the Biden administration, we're almost at 1 year mark, the Middle East maybe comes in 6th or 7th when it comes to the foreign policy priorities. Certainly after the 3 Cs of China, COVID and climate, and there are a few others ahead of that. And that doesn't even mention the domestic priorities. So the argument I'm making, and Peter and I have made here with some great comments from people who had reviewed the paper, is that the US actually has, yes, many challenges, but important opportunities. Opportunities in the region with a generational transition that are bringing new voices and new leaders to power across the region. And this began more than 10 years ago with some of the Arab uprisings. It's not ending, in part if you look at demographics. There are economic changes within the region that open the door to possibilities for greater economic cooperation within the region, but also between the United States and the region. And then lastly, this debate we've had over, I would say over more than a decade, about the change in America's internal debate about the Middle East, which I think is quite healthy, the diversification of new voices and talking about it and how the US should relate, I think could put us in a space for a much more sustainable and stable relationship in the region. So, but let me go quickly because I want to have the discussion. What are the core arguments that we're making and why I think it's important? The main reason why, in my view, is that the region itself represents an important bridge between the key regions of the world, Europe, Asia, and Africa. It's at a crucial crossroads. But then in addition to that, in and of itself, beyond energy supplies, there's a lot of great human potential and a way for the region to start to transform itself. And we see parts of the region doing that and others not so much. So that's the opportunity, is to look at the region, not solely through the frame of threats, which are certainly there, but for some of the opportunities. And the five key pillars, if you will, and this is a quite long report, but I'll just try to do a line or two on each, is number one, for the US to launch some joint initiatives on human security, such as COVID, the pandemic, climate change and human rights, and economic security. I highlight this, and I think maybe Mara will say a little bit about this, because I know the colleagues at CAP have been thinking about how security these days is very much transnational in nature, that it's sometimes hard to look simply at particular countries, that some of these challenges, as we've seen in the last 2 years of the pandemic, know no national borders. And in these challenges, including climate, they present actually opportunities for cooperation within the region, opportunities for the US to actually engage in a different way. So that's one component. And I think the Biden administration has looked especially to the climate issue and parts of the help they've given to some countries on vaccines. But I think we could certainly do more. The second pillar is the idea of putting diplomacy first to end conflicts in Syria, Yemen, and Libya. And I hope we'll get into this, because certainly I think the Biden administration has taken some steps in appointing envoys and really in their rhetoric prioritizing peace in places like Yemen. The question is, and I hope we discuss it, is there an integrated strategy? One that, in my view, diplomacy does not succeed unless there's some form of security measures and security cooperations that reduce the fears and instability in the region, and it's linked to diplomacy. This is important, the second pillar, in part because if you look at the state system in the Middle East, the civil wars themselves have actually undermined and weakened the state system, and the civil wars have caused massive humanitarian dislocation, death, and damage. The third pillar, which is, we put it third, and again, the order of priority is important in making these arguments, is to look at Iran through both diplomacy and through security measures. Now, if you look at the debate today, certainly on the Middle East, Iran is number one, and I understand why. I understand the urgency of the nuclear file, as well as Iran's actions in the region. In my view, the first two pillars, the civil wars and the human security, are really the foundations for the broader region, whether that fabric for a stable state system is there or it's tattered. And it's certainly, I think, tattered. I think, by and large, Iran and its engagements, as well as the reactions from multiple countries in the region because of what Iran does, has further frayed the state system. So we've had almost a year of diplomacy first on Iran, and I think the Biden administration is looking at various opportunities and options. And the key point in this report is that any plan B on Iran needs to necessarily include the regional dynamics, not just security, but those political perspectives at a time when countries like GCC states are directly engaging Iran. Fourth, and again, you could, and we did have separate reports on this, is to try to move forward on the Arab-Israeli front in practical ways and in ways that actually elevates and considers the Palestinians as central actors. Again, a basic point, but I think quite often forgotten, especially in the previous administration, where the Palestinian Authority was subjected to all sorts of isolation and pressure, things that did not produce the hoped for deal of the century. And in that discussion, not only I think have the Biden administration taken a step in the direction of trying to re-engage the Palestinian Authority just this week on economic issues, but I do think there's space for a broader strategic discussion with Israel about the long-term security cooperation, the basis for it, because in essence, a lot of the US taxpayer assistance that's been provided over the last few decades has become very politicized here in ways that I think is unhelpful. And there may be a pathway towards helping Israel stand on its own without this sort of framework from the last 40 years. And then lastly, and I'll close here, is a more balanced regional security policy. And again, I want to highlight, we put this last because most discussions, in my view, and a lot of the reports on the Middle East focus on what we do with the military, right? And it's often in debate against the current framework that we have with the military. In my view, the backing of a security umbrella that the United States has to diplomacy, putting diplomacy first, requires the backing of a security umbrella. And we're adapting it already. It's changing and it's evolving in many ways. What we propose in the report is moving from essentially this bilateral hub and spoke relationship where the US has been expected or seen as the security guarantor to one where we're serving more as the regional security integrator, starting with those partners that are already opening up to each other. That's a central idea. And again, I think quite often the debate is about how many troops do we have in a particular theater, and it often misses the bigger strategic question of, do we have our priorities straight, and are the security components still very much at the top of the agenda? So to close, and I went on a bit longer there, but I think what we're looking at is the end. I think we've already seen the end of a 40-year period of US policy in the Middle East from 1979 to 2019. In many ways. And I think we haven't yet clarified in our own debates what this new order and the new engagement looks like. This report attempts to offer that, from starting from the building blocks of human security and moving towards helping the region help itself become much more integrated and deal with many of its own challenges.
Thank you, Brian. I think that was a very excellent sort of overview of a very rich paper. I think you've laid out the main points very succinctly and eloquently. Of course, I do urge people to take their time and read the report carefully. It really is an excellent one. But thanks for that, Brian. Let me quickly introduce our panel and then engage them in some questions and conversation. As I mentioned, Mara Rudman is with us here from the Center for American Progress. This is a joint event between the Middle East Institute and CAP. The report did come out of CAP. Mara is the Executive Vice President for Policy at the Center for American Progress. She's had several government positions, including Deputy Assistant to the President for National Security Affairs in the Obama and Clinton administrations, Deputy Envoy and Chief of Staff for the Office of the Special Envoy for Middle East Peace, U.S. Department of State Assistant Administrator for the Middle East at the USAID, Agency for International Development. In the private sector, she's also been the Senior Vice President at Business Executives for National Security and led Quorum Strategies, a geopolitical strategic advisory firm. Mara, thanks for being with us today. Ambassador Ann Patterson, I'm sure, is known to most of you. Ambassador Patterson is the Kissinger Senior Fellow at the Jackson Institute for Global Affairs at Yale University. She served as Assistant Secretary for Near Eastern and North African Affairs at the Department of State between 2013 and 2017. She held several ambassadorial posts, ambassador to Egypt, during the critical years of the uprising, the events there, ambassador to Pakistan, to Colombia, and to El Salvador. She retired with the rank of career ambassador after more than 4 decades in the Foreign Service. Joining us is Ambassador Gerald Firestein, who's with the Middle East Institute. He is the Senior Vice President at MEI and the Distinguished Senior Fellow on U.S. Diplomacy. He too has had a long and illustrious career in the Foreign Service. He retired in 2016, which is when he joined the Middle East Institute. He served in 9 overseas postings, including 3 tours in Pakistan, tours in Saudi Arabia, Oman, Lebanon, Jerusalem, and Tunisia. And he served as ambassador to Yemen during the critical years there of the uprising and the early years of the transition before things went south, as it were, and things sank into the conflict that we see today. He ended his career in the Foreign Service as Principal Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for Near Eastern Affairs, working alongside Ambassador Patterson. That was from 2013 to 2016. Ambassador Patterson, let me start with you. You've served a number of U.S. administrations. What do you see as sort of the arc or the trajectory of U.S. policy in the Middle East? Brian touched on it, talked in terms of 40 years of a certain type of U.S. policy. One could identify after 9/11, yet another type and another level of engagement. And yet now we're entering something different. This paper attempts to address that. So what would your thoughts and comments be about our trajectory and how this paper engages with it?
Well, first, thank you very much, Paul. And let me compliment the Center for American Progress and Brian Katulis on the report, and thank the Middle East Institute and CAP for hosting this event. And let me say that I hope this report will be widely studied, because the U.S. will not be able to engage from the Middle East, and this report offers a more productive way forward. I think in response to your question, certainly since the Arab Spring, U.S. policy has been largely reactive. And we were forced in many respects, I think, to lurch from crisis to crisis. Syria, Yemen, Libya. I know this happened during the Obama administration, and it seemed even worse to me during the Trump administration. Yes, of course, there were successes like the fight against ISIS, but it took 5 years, was exceptionally bloody. And there were left behind wreckage we're going to be dealing with for years. There were also intensive diplomatic efforts on Syria, on the Arab-Israeli issues, but ultimately they did not change the situation on the ground. And I think for Americans, it was very difficult to move past the war on terror, because so much of our government infrastructure was focused on counterterrorism to the exclusion of other priorities. Not to debate this, it was just a fact. Expertise on terrorism was prized, while expertise on climate change or disease or economics was not. Accordingly, there was very little attention given to the human security dimension outlined in the report, which is the cause of so many of the region's problems. I totally agree with about the disengagement from the Middle East. It focused excessively on the U.S. bases on the Gulf and equipment like Patriot missiles. I think this is because these issues are quantifiable. Everybody can count how many troops are in U.S. bases or how many Patriot missiles, and Americans intuitively understand we have to shift to Asia. But the real reason Americans want to leave the Middle East, and perhaps Afghanistan, and in some respects is the best example, it's frustration with poor outcomes. It's a staggering cost. And in the US government, it's the huge amounts of senior management time that the region consumes with no results. But for all the reasons outlined in the report, a withdrawal is not in the cards. As we saw in the past few months, and for all the talk about new approach, American policymakers still had to go hand in hand to the Saudis to raise oil production so that US gas prices would decline. And we still have to deal with the Egyptians to mediate with Hamas for Israel's security. So we can't let frustration blind us to the strategic consequences of the US withdrawal, in the hopes that these countries will work out their problems among themselves. A few points in the report I wanted to highlight. I would put more stress on US encouragement of employment generation and regional integration. These problems almost guarantee there's going to be a resurgence of the violence and disruption of the Arab Spring. Where and when, we'll be surprised, I think. there was almost no focus on an overall economic strategy for years, in some respects because of the size of the markets. The first Bush administration tried to liberalize trade, but that effort failed. That was 25 years ago. Now, as the report says, countries like the UAE, Qatar, Saudi Arabia, and of course, Israel are taking serious steps at diversification and entrepreneurships, and some are well positioned to help each other. Egypt, the West Bank, and many other countries are full of promising young women and men who could benefit, as the report says. So this is an opportunity as well as offering opportunities for U.S. companies. On the security issues, I personally find it hard to see a U.S. alternative to U.S. protection of shipping lanes. As Jason Bordoff at Columbia and others have written, these countries are only going to be more important in energy markets in the aftermath of COVID and environmental regulations. But they have to learn to protect themselves. And our security assistance programs need a really hard look, both the ones that the US pays for in Egypt, Jordan, and Lebanon, and the ones that these countries buy from us. And that's going to require transparency in what we're doing, serious effort at refocusing our own efforts and the efforts of our allies, all of whom hawk unsuitable high-end equipment. So that I think needs a lot of emphasis. And then finally, the report recommends a diplomacy-heavy approach and a move away from a militarized foreign policy. Well, this is going to require more and different diplomatic resources, more people who speak Arabic, expertise on climate change, expertise on conflict and negotiation. This is actually embarrassingly thin within the US government. More American consulates in regions that suffer from these problems. And those places are invariably going to be dangerous. So our own house is something we should be able to fix because it's going to be key to a strategic re-engagement in the Middle East. Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador Patterson. Before I turn to you, Ambassador Firestein, I want to remind the audience or tell the audience, we do have a Q&A function on Zoom. So after we have the initial discussion with the panelists, I'll try to integrate questions from you, the audience. So please use the Q&A feature. If you're following on YouTube or Facebook where you're not on Zoom, please email your questions to events@mei.edu. That's events@mei.edu. Ambassador Firestein, let me ask you sort of two layers of questions. One, sort of similar to Ambassador Patterson, you've had a long career in U.S. foreign policy towards the Middle East. You've seen the ups and downs of different administrations dealing with this region. How does the report address, how does it answer some key questions that you've lived through? But also with MEI, you've, among many other things, been following Middle Eastern affairs, Gulf affairs in particular. Do you see the region moving towards a more sustained, more, are they de-escalating, being more reasonable, more sustained? So a two-layered question, Jerry, if I may.
Thanks, Paul, and again, thanks to CAP for doing this report, to Brian and to Peter. I think overall that, like you and like Anne, I found that the recommendations in the report are solid. I think that they point us in the right direction. Unfortunately, I would say that over the last, Brian said 40 years. I think that 40 years is about right, since 1979, but certainly since 2003, our approach to the region has been too heavily oriented towards the military and security, and we've neglected many of these other issues that are of importance. Anne talked about the issue of demography, of economic diversification. Those are clearly going to be important. There are, and this is, I think that the report lays out an enduring tension in the way that the United States approaches the region in talking about, issues related to support for democratization, civil liberties, human rights. Those are important. They're important for Americans, We want a foreign policy that recognizes that those things are key. And we do believe, based on our own history and our own experiences, that governments that respect those things are stronger and more viable. And yet those are also issues that put us at times into conflict with our friends and partners. And that's something, that tension is something that we always need to manage and to figure out how to go forward, how to maintain strong relationships with governments, even though we may differ with them on some of the core approaches that we and they take on these internal issues. Narrowing down on the narrower issue of how does this play in the Gulf, which is the area that, of course, I cover mostly for MEI. What I would say is that what we saw in the CAP report is very consistent with what we're seeing in the Gulf of themselves. And what we've seen over the past year particularly is that many of these GCC states have made the decision that they want to change their fundamental approach, the fundamental dynamic of political, economic, and security concerns in the region. This has been described as a desire to turn the page, if you will, to get beyond what we've seen over the last 10 or 20 years. And they are putting their emphasis exactly on those issues. So what we saw beginning earlier this year with the Al-Ula agreement that ended the conflict with Qatar within the GCC, but also the dialogues that they pursued, particularly Saudi Arabia and the UAE with Iran, the openings to Turkey, all of these things. And also, of course, the CAP report lays out the importance of diplomatic engagement on issues like Syria and Yemen. That has been very much a part of the strategy that these governments in the region have pursued over these past 12 months. Now, we know that the turn to diplomacy in Yemen hasn't actually brought us any kind of fruits at this moment. How do you go forward? And I think that this is an issue that's worth discussing a little bit more about the CAP approach. But also, of course, as we've been discussing, the desire of the GCC states and others to see the reintegration of Syria back into the Arab League, as well as the strengthening of the relationships with Iraq after a period of strain. So we saw in the GCC Summit communique that just came out earlier this week, a reflection of these changes, a reflection of the way the GCC states want to alter their course a little bit. Tone and tenor of the communique was quite different from what we've seen in the past, in the way that they talk about the broader regional concerns, but also how they talk about their own internal efforts to promote integration economically and socially and through infrastructure. This is a real change for them. I think that to a certain extent, what we're seeing, it's not only a desire to see the rise of diplomacy, but it's also a reflection of the exhaustion that many of the states and many of the populations in the region are feeling after nearly 2 years of pandemic. After the recognition of the economic and demographic changes, and again, talked a little bit about the diversification push, which reflects, at least in part, the recognition that they need to open up a new way of dealing with their own populations and bringing them into productive engagement with the society. It's also a recognition that the heavy security approach over the last 10, 20, 30 years has failed. It has not brought benefit. It has not brought increased security to these countries. It has not benefited their populations. I think that also the other important point, and again, I congratulate CAP for doing this report. It also implicates our own strategies and the way that we've approached the region over these past number of years. The lack of direction that's come out of the United States, we've heard this directly from our interlocutors in the region, lack of direction, changing policies, And they listen to our debates, they read our newspapers, they know what the thinking is about how to go forward, and the pivot to Asia and all of those things. They listen to us. And at the same time, we haven't listened to them. We haven't been listening to what they've been saying to us. We can no longer assume that we are primus inter pares in the relationships in the Gulf. And I think that we need to recognize that. Our prioritization of military and security issues is increasingly out of sync with what the Gulf states themselves want and what they're trying to accomplish on their own. At the same time, our neglect of economic issues, of some of these broader social issues, has also left the door open for others, for China and for Russia in particular, to move forward, to become key partners in the region. Recent polls suggest that populations of the region more or less don't see the United States as being significantly different from Russia or China anymore. They put us all more or less on the same level. So how does the United States respond to this? How do we switch gears? I think, again, we need to do a better job listening to our partners in the region. We need to find ways of addressing their priorities as well as ensuring that they follow, our priorities. I believe, on the military and security side, I don't think that there's going to be a significant change in the way these countries go forward. The fact of the matter is that all of them have militaries that are built around a U.S. Architecture, U.S. equipment, U.S. doctrine, U.S. training. Those are not things that you turn around and change on a dime. I accept the CAP recommendation that we become more of a facilitator of integration in regional militaries. It's a great idea. Unfortunately, it's something that we've been trying to do for 20 or 30 years without success, and not because of any lack of trying on our part. But if we can do it, that would be super. But beyond defense and security, I think that we need to find new ways of competing in the region. And we need to recognize that it is a competition, and it's not only a competition between the United States, China, and Russia. Israel is a competitor for a role in the region. Asia, India, Japan, South Korea, Europe. I mean, look at the Macron visit to Saudi Arabia and the UAE. These are challenges to our roles and our leadership of the region that's going to go forward. And if we're going to be serious about maintaining our edge there, then we need to be serious about recognizing these challenges. So I think that at the end, just to wrap up, I think that the CAP report puts a number of very serious, very practical, very implementable proposals on the table. I think that they lay out a good approach to the region. And again, I think that for the Gulf states, at least, what CAP is proposing is very much in line with what they're discussing amongst themselves as where the directions that they want to go.
Thank you. Thanks, Ambassador Firestein. Let me turn to Mara Redman, the Executive Vice President for Policy at CAP. Mara, most of us on this panel have spent most of our lives dealing with the Middle East. We're very kind of a little bit blinkered maybe on the Middle East. You sit atop, CAP, which is both has a big, focus on the U.S., a bit of the internal developments, but also the U.S. broadly speaking. Sort of, again, two layers of questions. One is, regardless of this report, where do you see the Middle East situated in America's foreign policy perspectives? As Brian mentioned, there's the 3 Cs. We have Russia, there's issues of, trade, climate, COVID, many other issues. Where does the Middle East fit in that? And then how do you see this report? Does it get it right in terms of right sizing both the amount of attention and effort and the type of attention and effort? Does that coalesce with a sort of global, potential global strategy? So over to you, Mara.
Thanks. Appreciate that, Paul. And also really appreciate the opportunity to see again and be speaking with Ann Patterson and Jerry Firestein. Nice to have this kind of forum, to have this kind of discussion with all of you. So thank you for that. In terms of the reporters, so the caveat is, I will say at the front end, I don't think I can be objective about it because I really saw it from its earliest gestation stages with Brian and Peter. And as we try to do many things at American Progress, it had a lot of different cooks along the way. Brian was masterful, I think, at getting it to where it is. So happy to offer comments, Paul, but I just want to be clear on that context. I don't have the distance from it that I ought to really comment. But I think that I will say the process of going through creating the report has also helped us within American Progress think through how to meet some of these very significant global challenges, and frankly, how to better position the United States vis-a-vis China and Russia. And I'm not trying to equate the two, but Jerry, I think I differ from you a little bit, and I get that there are a lot of different competitors for leadership in the regional space. I think for the United States, it's really important for us to have our eye clearly on, again, different reasons, China and Russia, and how we can maximize our competitiveness in that context. I do not think that's through a language like a pivot or the kind of concept of what people have when they talk about pivoting or rebalancing. I think it's how to be smarter in bringing all of our resources as a country to bear in tackling some of these very significant global or transnational challenges, issues that really don't have borders. And so I really embrace what the report has set up that way. I might double down on it even further in the sense that we are increasingly, we at American Progress, Brian is part of this, increasingly thinking about categories of significant global challenges. So Brian talked about human security. I might put climate and human security, which encompasses to me migration, food security, global health, pandemic issues under human security. Climate, absolutely, and climate, of course, ties to migration. There are big issues with climate forcing migration, as well as the other parts of it that are key components, but tremendous opportunities within those challenges in a region like the Middle East. If you look at what's happening on desalinization, what's happening in the use of technology in various ways with leading Middle East actors, it's an interesting example. Jerry Firestein, to your point on Israel really leading on some of the desalinization technology, but Qatar, the Emirates also very much cutting edge there, and where and how that can have benefits, not just for the region, where it's a key component of climate challenges, but more broadly around the world, and how the United States can work with and benefit from that, just as one example in the climate space. And obviously interrelated with embedded in climate is some of the real energy issues for the region, but those are also not only in terms of obviously the oil resources, and the point that was made earlier on the key tie for the United States role in terms of security for economic competitiveness globally of what happens in terms of oil and the region, which is not going to dissipate even as we build up as we must on the renewable resources side. But many countries in the region are also leading in technology and innovation on renewable resources as well. So there are many component parts under climate. This leads also very, very much interlinked with economic competitiveness. I agree, and I had that thought reading through the report in this most recent round. And Brian, don't kill me for this, since I had many opportunities to make this point earlier. But I do think we go light on the economic competitiveness component and the importance of it in terms of what the region has to offer, but is again a major question and strategy for the United States and how we position ourselves in the world, to the point where it should be incidental that helps us in terms of China. It's stuff it's a positioning that we need to do for ourselves, the United States, and we need to maximize what our relationships are across the world with, so the Middle East no less, and in many cases more, given where different countries in the region are on that. And then in the whole area of accountability, which I would define quite broadly, of everything from making sure that wherever you are in the world, if you're a bad actor, you don't get away. We have maximum systems in place so you don't get away with bad acts. And that's both on an individual basis in terms of huge challenges with organized crime. It goes to misinformation and disinformation challenges as well, where as we know, the countries of the Middle East are, I don't know, it's fair to call them leaders in this regard, but certainly no less challenged than the rest of us, and have used some of their technology strengths for, frankly, creating more challenges here. And it's also an area where tremendous issues with both Russia and China and how they're handling misinformation, disinformation, various aspects of accountability, and where the United States should be positioned to be a leader in this space. I do not want to say that we're there at this point, but we should have opportunities to do better on the accountability front, working with other open and inclusive societies in the region, around the world, where they're not as open and inclusive as we might like. How do we get them there? By coming together to tackle some of these common global challenges. So I look at the challenges as opportunities in the geopolitical sense, and also in just putting the United States more on the track to where we need to go, where we need to be 10 years from now, 20 years from now, as a country. And I look at the countries of the Middle East as being partners with us in how we get there. So not about doing less, doing things differently, looking at things through a different prism. I look forward to the conversation.
Thank you very much, Mara. Thanks a lot. Brian, let me get to you and give you a chance to respond to some of the great points. Some of them were questions, some remarks raised by the panelists. Brian, over to you.
Yeah, I mean, it's a rich set of comments, and I think with the panel that we have, who've served at very senior levels and for years in government. The one thing I'm reflecting on, because I think I think there's not disagreement that we should try to shift more to look at these other tools, diplomacy and economic tools especially, and point heard. The question I have, and it's not back to the panelists, it's more, do we have the structures? Do we have the capacity, not only in our civilian agencies in the State Department? Are they situated properly? In my view, also the private sector in the United States plays a very, very important role. There's a study to be written somewhere that looks at the US jobs that are connected to the Middle East, and not just through arms sales and oil, the sort of mainstays, but there's new sectors that have been bubbling up over the last several years. Anne had hinted at this. I think everyone on this call, the panelists who had served in government, I think at different phases, served in the different phases of whether it was transformational diplomacy under Condoleezza Rice at the State Department, or smart power, the smart power efforts. And it's not just about, and this is the point I want to stress, it's not just about the budget figures. Quite often the debate is about sort of the how much money and the numbers. Anne made this point, which was really interesting, that why is there a fixation on the either military presence or equipment, because it's quantifiable. But to me, you know, after 2 quadrennial diplomacy and development reviews, if you remember those, in the Obama era, my impression is that a lot of what we put in this report are very, very good ideas, I think. Obviously, I wrote it, but my one question is then on the capacity front, do we have the right structures? Is America situated, especially on this economic engagement front? And by that, I mean not just the government, but especially a public-private partnership, because some of these new creative openings on desalinization and energy cooperation is the manifestation of not just what the governments in the region are doing, but also some aspects of the private sector. Is the US prepared to do that? That's, to me, is the interesting discussion to be had, to try to take these concepts, the central concept of diplomacy first, less fixated on the military, into practice. The second thing, and it's a point, you know, related to capacity, and we make this in the report itself, But if you understand my approach, and we highlight, this is just a view, and I know people disagree with it, and it's good. But the notion that politicizing U.S. foreign policy, and especially politicizing key aspects of U.S. engagement in the Middle East, there have been many incentives in our political system to do that. And I understand the rationale behind it. My view is that America is actually in a stronger position when there's more consensus between the parties. And here at MEI, where we've just launched an initiative to try to, again, have a new type of conversation about that amongst the different parties. And I know that's debated because, but my view is that when other outside actors, whether it's close partners in the Gulf or adversaries like Iran, see the differences in our own politics and they see the gaps, they try to exploit them for their own purposes. And quite often they're able to do that because of the divisions, but also going back, and this is the final thing I'll say, this absence of a North Star in US engagement, meaning the absence of sort of a key top priority that I think all of the panelists, from Ann to Jerry to Mara, have talked about, is that quite often we're in a reactive tactical position. And this is where I'll close, is that I think at the end of Biden's first year in office, a year that was highlighted by, the what I call the Biden administration's Michael Corleone moment on the Middle East, the Gaza crisis, where just when they thought they were out, they were trying to stay above the fray, they were pulled back in. So many, and what I worry about after 1 year, despite an attempt to put diplomacy first in Yemen and the diplomatic attempts on Iran, integrating sort of diplomacy with the security and economic tools has not yet manifested itself. And what I think that positions the administration for is either being a bystander or being a reactor to trends in the region rather than a driver.
Thanks, Brian, and I want to thank the audience. There are a number of very excellent questions coming in on the Q&A function. I will try to integrate as many as I can. Our time is short, so Brian or others, if I direct questions, try to be a bit telegraphic in your answers so we can get as many as possible. Let me ask you a question, Brian, and also link a bit to a question asked by the audience members. And this partly relates to competition with Russia and China, partly relates to changes that have been happening in the Middle East, and that is about what U.S. represents. U.S. I sadly say used to be a robust example of democracy and fairly good governance. In the last few years, it is neither. I would say it's and for the people of the world and the people of the region, the U.S. was looked to as an example, and that was a lot of its soft power. We even saw a lot of that, in parts of the Arab Spring. This administration just had a summit for democracy, and I would like your thoughts on that. Under the Biden administration's watch, 2 countries that were in democratic transition in the Middle East, that transition ended or has been suspended, and that's Sudan and Tunisia, without much of a reaction from the U.S. And that links a little bit to a question asked by one of our audience members about corruption, which is another aspect of governance. You mentioned human rights in your remarks and in the report. Could you say a bit more about democracy, good governance? Should that be part of the U.S.'s, an important part of it? It's not one of the pillars. Where do you see it stand?
I actually think it should be one of the pillars, and I think on the Summit for Democracy, though I was a skeptic, and I do think it still remains to be seen what practical things will actually be implemented there. If you look under the hood at what was committed and what was said, there are things like an anti-corruption initiative that was outlined in advance of the Summit, which I actually think is very important and quite clearly touches upon the Middle East on almost every single country. Lebanon, we've been talking about here at MEI quite a lot and doing lots of reports on it. The question is then, how do you implement it, right? How do you take what might have been something that functional teams have looked at or was put out there, and as I understand it from some friends in Congress, a lot of the money that was presented as commitments were just represented, money that was already in the pipeline. So the key to me is, how do you actually then thread this through your policy? bilaterally with each of the individual countries and make it a priority and prioritize it. And again, I will keep it short because I think the colleagues on the panel here have much more experience in trying to navigate those trends, because I'm of the view that, yes, the human rights discussion has to be part of the equation with every single country. It's just, how do you effectively address that to get results? In our debates these days, I think there's a bit of self-absorption about how much the threat of security assistance or cutting off arms sales will actually get people unjustly jailed or suffering from human rights abuses, how quickly that would actually change the situation. I actually think the art of diplomacy is actually trying to build trust and confidence to create new conditions, and then also have that diplomacy connect with other people than just simply the strongmen and the leaders in the security agencies in that region. But I don't want to go on too long, because I know, and Anne was on a panel at CAP with Gordon Gray and a few other colleagues a few years ago talking about the reflections on the Arab Spring. So there's a lot of experience on this panel, more than I have.
Well, let me ask Anne, Jerry, and Mara to hold your fire for now. I'm going to shoot a few questions to Brian just to get them out there, but then I'm going to come to each of you. So please then pick up any parts of any of the questions I shot to Brian as we, as we approach the end of the session. Brian, a number of questions from the audience about two related items. One is the Abraham Accords. How serious are they? How did the report address them? And much related to that, I mean, these accords initially seemed to weaken or make the situation of Palestinians worse, or much less leverage than before. Conditions of Palestinians, whether in refugee camps or under occupation, it remains very terrible. How do you see both dynamics? Is there any potential for positive interlinkage there? Quick answer, Brian.
Yeah, real quick is I saw the Accords as a positive step forward for the region, but clearly came in a context where a US administration was trying to isolate the Palestinians. We're in a new context and a new administration that is re-engaging and not just looking at the Palestinians as a subset of the US-Israel bilateral relationship. What I think is missing right now is a concerted effort to not just deepen the accords between Israel and the parties to those accords and the normalization agreements, but to link it to actually a better political and then economic environment for the Palestinians. We are currently in a one-state scenario, and it's hard to see with the dysfunction inside of and the divisions inside both Israeli and Palestinian politics, forward progress there. But I do think if the US were to lean in, and it currently isn't, in creating a linkage to make sure that these accords don't simply serve as some sort of bypass road around the Palestinians, because it won't produce justice, it won't produce a sustainable solution, and it won't actually strengthen the broader state system.
Thanks, Brian. And there are a lot of other questions, but let me turn in reverse order to our panelists. So let me start with you, Mara. Any reactions or thoughts about these questions or Brian's comments?
Sure. Let me just touch on the first on the human rights, governance, corruption issues. That is what I was trying, however inarticulated, to get at in talking about accountability, because I actually think putting that very important work into the bigger context that I think, frankly, many more people around the world than in this country might get. I don't know if the word is accountability, but that bad actors have to pay for actions, and that there are enforceable mechanisms set up to make that happen in a variety of different spaces. And I think that that's also an opportunity for the United States to partner with like-minded countries to move forward in those areas. Just one quick example. So coming from the Summit for Democracy, I think it would be great if a number of those goals were built into bilateral conversations with key outcomes that were expected for the various diplomats that were engaging. I also think looking at mechanisms like the G7 for a group of countries coming together, we see the interconnections between economic competitiveness and accountability and corruption challenges. So work with groups and alliances like that to set out concrete routes going forward. On the Abraham Accords, I support what Brian has said and the various challenges involved. I just think a key strategic planning internally with actors focused on what they want to get to and how, and looking at the near and medium term as right now as important to hope to keep us with a path that gets us back to a two-state possibility is very, very important. And there's one more question I unfortunately am going to have to drop off. So I'm just going to hit briefly on the issue around the question around the Development Finance Corporation, which is a combination of development funding mechanisms that AID had and what used to be the Overseas Private Investment Corporation. I think that is a phenomenal tool. I saw OPIC work quite effectively with some key investments and innovative investments with Palestinians during the second Bush administration, and to some extent during President Obama's time. My hope is that they have figured out a way to focus on middle-income countries and not only low-income countries. OPIC could do that. In some of the change to the Development Finance Corporation, that ability, as I understand it, was omitted. And obviously, a number of the key countries you need to engage with to move things forward would be characterized as middle income, as opposed to just the lower income countries. So maybe more technical than people want, but it's an important point to keep an eye on, as the questioner did, flag the Development Finance Corporation as an important tool for some of the things we've been talking about. And I'm going to say thank you now to everyone for being on, because I unfortunately have to leave early. So
thanks for joining us, Mara. Thanks a lot, and great to have this joint event with CAP. Thank you, Mara. Jerry, let me turn to you for your thoughts about these questions that were raised, but also a couple of other questions raised by panelists about the Gulf per se. One is the report talks a lot about diplomacy, but with the Gulf, we don't, we see less diplomacy and more military engagement exercises. The DoD is heavily present. There's a lot of arms sales. We just did another arms sale in the region. So, how do we lead with diplomacy with the Gulf? Another question about the Gulf, is the Al-Ula thing real? Is it lasting? Is it deep? Or is it just kind of photo op type of thing? As well as you might have comments about the other questions.
Thanks, Paul, and happy to respond. On the issue of diplomacy versus military exercises, arms sales, I don't see those things as being mutually exclusive or necessarily in competition with one another. I think that those are aspects of a broader strategy. I know that there was a specific question about the sale of air-to-air missiles to Saudi Arabia as something that was controversial here in the United States. I think that if we want diplomacy to succeed in Yemen, and I believe that we all do, I think it's also important to demonstrate to the Houthis that, in fact, their military offensive inside of Yemen, as well as across the border into Saudi Arabia, will fail. And we have to recognize that there is often a security and military component to successful diplomacy and successful diplomatic engagement. I think that this is an example of that. On the Al-Ula Accord, we'll see. I think that the earlier assessment when the agreement was first announced was that it was papering over differences within the GCC. But we're a year into it now, and I think that what we've seen, and again, looking back at what happened this week in Riyadh at the GCC Summit, there is some, reason to believe that, in fact, the GCC states have made a decision internally that they need to move forward together, and in particular, to move forward on some of these economic and social issues that are of immediate concern to all of them. So I think it's positive. We saw Mohammed bin Salman's successful trip through the region in advance of the summit. We saw a positive outcome of the summit. And in some ways, and again, this diplomatic offensive that we've seen, particularly from the Saudis and the Emiratis over this past year, is indication that there's a greater alignment now within the GCC of how to manage the region as opposed to where we were before. And so even if, and certainly what we've heard is that there's not a real tangible, substantive dialogue, negotiation between the Saudis and the Iranians. Nevertheless, the change in tenor means that we have opportunities to manage conflict in the region as opposed to being in a conflictual situation. And that's a positive thing. And I think it makes it easier for the GCC states to work together. So we'll see on that. A couple of other things. On the Abraham Accords, I think that Brian made the core points. What I would say is that the Abraham Accords are a two-edged sword. And the reality is that while the initial response and the initial assessment of the Abraham Accords was that it isolated the Palestinians, it basically left the Palestinians off the table. Nevertheless, by making relationships with core Arab states, particularly the UAE, but also Morocco, also Bahrain, by making them a central part of Israeli foreign policy, they've also increased the capacity of those states to influence the direction of Israeli thinking and Israeli policies vis-a-vis the Palestinians. And so I believe that what we should be doing is encouraging those states to be more vocal, to be more direct in their dialogue with the Israelis about the importance that they attach to seeing Israel take the right decisions on the Palestinian issue. And I think that in a way would strengthen our hand and strengthen the hand of those who would like to see advances on Israeli-Palestinian issues. And then the last point that I'll make of this whole question about politicizing foreign policy, let me just make one point, and that is if you look at Obama, Trump, Biden, the reality is that the through line is not all that different. There's differences in tone, in nuance, in how the various administrations address these issues. But the reality is that on an operational level, in terms of the implementation of foreign policy, we haven't seen huge differences. And if you go to Congress and look at, some of the issues that have come before Congress, even on Iran, I would say, there aren't necessarily huge divisions on a Democratic Republican side. There are divisions, but they don't necessarily break down on a binary two-party line. So I think that we need to be a little bit careful about how we describe the politicization of U.S. foreign policy. And let me stop there.
Thank you very much, Jerry. Anne, you will have the last word in this great panel, so over to you.
Well, I just want to comment on a couple of things that Brian said and the questions that I on corruption. There are enormous variations among Middle East countries on the degree of corruption. And let me say, frankly, the U.S. needs to get its act together too on this, because a lot of this money is sitting in trusts in South Dakota and New York apartments. And there's been a huge transparency on that in the press recently. And that's something we've got to address before we lecture the rest of the world about it. On the issue of in the chat or the question, one of the viewers said we need more granular understanding about the differences among these countries, and I couldn't agree with that more, because we tend to look at it as one big problem-ridden Islamic blob, and that can be solved, I think, through better expertise, longer assignments, and more dedication, really, and more investment in diplomatic resources. And finally, I want to conclude with the issue that always comes up and is so super tough, and that's the balance between human rights and other strategic interests. When I was in the Middle East Bureau, there was no issue, for years, no issue we struggled with more than this one. And like I mentioned, with Egypt and Saudi Arabia, these are not paragons of human rights performance, but we need them on hugely important strategic interests. So we're just going to have to work on that constantly and balance it. And there's no other solution. There's no quick fix to this. It's just a hard problem.
Thank you. Thank you, Ambassador Patterson. Let me thank our great panelists, Ambassador Patterson, Ambassador Firestein, and Mara Rudman, who had to leave. Of course, we want to thank Brian Katulis and Peter Joule for writing this report. I want to thank the audience for sticking with us this hour and for the questions that you shot our way. Do get a chance to read the report when you have some time. Please stay tuned for other events. Brian, you might have some closing words you want to say.
No, just thank you all. And I hope we continue discussions like this.
All right.